welcome everyone. My name is Brianna Povener, and I'm a research scientist and educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And welcome to our Hot Topic program. I'm just going to go over a little bit of logistics before we get started. So we're using a Zoom webinar platform, so we can't see you and we can't hear you. But if you have questions, you can type them into the little two speech bubble looking Q&A button. And once we start the program, I will be turning off my microphone and my video. I will be sort of behind the scenes. I will try to answer some of those questions when I can. But after the presentation part of the program, I will be asking the speaker the questions that are typed into the Q&A. I definitely won't be able to get to all of the questions based on our past Hot Topic programs, but I will do my best. There is also live closed captions. You can see a little box that says CC at the bottom with live transcript, or maybe at the top of your screen, depending on what device you're using. So if you click on that, you can see live closed captions. And we will be recording and posting this program on the NMNH video webinars page within a few weeks. So if you didn't catch something, if you want to see it again, if you want to recommend it to other folks to watch, we'll be able to do it that way. So I do see we still have some people logging on, but we will get started because we're just after 11:30. So welcome everyone to our Hot Topic program this month, Human Origins Today. My name is Brianna Povener, and I'm a research scientist and educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. So the way that this program will work is I will introduce our speaker, who will give about a 20-25 minute PowerPoint presentation. And then when that's done, we will go to audience questions in the Q&A, which I will then read out for the speaker to answer. So I'd love to introduce Christina Balentine, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's also a pre-doctoral fellow at the National Museum of Natural History with us in the Department of Anthropology. In her dissertation research, Christina analyzes DNA from ancient and present-day humans in tandem with sociocultural data to help uncover the social and biotic forces shaping genetic diversity in Indigenous peoples who inhabit extreme environments in the Americas. Christina is also passionate about public STEM education, co-organizing a biology outreach program at UT Austin, and designing outreach programs for schools and museums. She hopes to continue doing STEM outreach and genomics research after she completes her PhD. Today, Christina is going to discuss some of her research on the superhuman ways in which people survive and thrive in seemingly inhospitable environments all around the world. So welcome. Thank you for being with us, Christina. I'm going to ask you to share your screen so we can see your slides. And when you're ready to turn off your microphone. Turn on your microphone, turn off the mute.
Alrighty, there's all good?
All good, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Brianna. And hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm so excited to share some of my research today. I'm going to share some fun, interesting stories of human superpowers that humans all around the world have. Now, I don't know about you all, but I don't personally know of any humans that can fly or become invisible, at least not without some really advanced technology. But humans do have some pretty special superpowers of their own that I am going to share with you all today. As Brianna said, this is the focus of my dissertation research. I study genetic adaptation to extreme environments. Specifically, I want to know how changes in DNA, as well as other biological and cultural processes, give people the power and ability to thrive in extreme environments all around the world. But before we get started traveling the world to see, meet some awesome superhumans, I want to give a quick definition. I'm going to be using the word adaptation a lot in this presentation, and somewhat frustratingly, depending on the context, adaptation can mean one of many different things. But the term adaptation, the definition for adaptation I am using today is the evolutionary and genetic adaptation, or definition of adaptation. And that definition is an adaptation is a trait that is inherited. That means if a parent has it, their offspring will have it. This is a trait that helps an organism survive, thrive, and successfully reproduce in their environment. In other words, it makes them more fit for their environment. And it has arisen as a result of natural selection acting on it for its primary function. So an example of an adaptation in humans is grasping thumbs. So grasping thumbs is a trait. It's inherited. Parents have it, their offspring have thumbs. Thumbs also make us more fit for our environment. When I was a kid, we used to have, or there was like this challenge going around where you would tape your thumb to your palm and try to eat food or eat a bowl of spaghetti without your thumbs, and see how difficult that was. And in fact, I looked up on YouTube. It's still a thing. I'm really glad that YouTube didn't exist for that to be recorded when I was a kid. But as we can see from these fun little challenges, that thumbs are very important today for us to eat, but also it was important for our ancestors to eat. It makes us easier to grab the foods that we need to eat, and the more food you have, the more nutrients you get, and therefore the more offspring you are able to have. And finally, we know it's driven by natural selection because we see fossil hominins, our ancestors, in the fossil record had opposable or grasping thumbs. For instance, this skeletal hand here is an Australopithecus sediba that lived 2 million years ago. So it's important to keep in mind that the environmental context is important for adaptations. For example, if hominins, our ancestors, had evolved to eat different foods, if they evolved to eat grasses, to graze on grasses like sheep or cattle, then most likely opposable thumbs, grasping thumbs, would not have been selected for. But the fact that we need them to eat the foods that we have eaten over the past millions of years, and that it makes us more fit and that it's inherited, we can call this thumbs an adaptation. So these adaptations arise as a result of small changes in the DNA sequence of individuals that over hundreds or even thousands of generations, or even longer, as the case with opposable thumbs, it's been at least 50,000 generations that opposable thumbs have been in the human lineage. These small changes spread throughout a population because it's beneficial in them. So now that we're all on the same page with adaptation, we're going to start flying all over the world to meet some superhuman people with some superhuman powers. We're going to be traveling from here in Washington, D.C., where the Smithsonian Sun is, to visit some people that thrive in some pretty extreme environments. And first place we're going to visit is a town high up in the Andes Mountains in South America. The highest town in the world is in Peru, in the Andes Mountains, and it's called La Rinconada. The elevation of La Rinconada is 5,130 meters above sea level, which is over 16,800 feet above sea level. That's 3 miles higher than the ocean. For some comparison, Washington, D.C. is only about 125 meters or 409 feet above sea level. And even the highest towns that you can visit in the United States, which are found in Colorado, are only around 3,200 meters or 10,000 feet above sea level. So for someone like me, I don't know if you can tell, I grew up in a sunny, low elevation desert in Arizona. If I, who grew up in a low elevation, were to move to La Rinconada, it would be very, very strenuous on my body. At high altitudes, there's less oxygen in the air. About 50% less oxygen is found in the air in somewhere like La Rinconada compared to at sea level. For a more concrete example, when you're at sea level, the percent of oxygen in the air that we breathe, because air is made up of a bunch of different elements, nitrogen, oxygen, argon, the percentage of oxygen in the air we breathe is 21%. But when you go up to La Rinconada, it is only 11%. So each breath that you take delivers less oxygen to your blood, which is necessary to keep your body functioning and healthy. Also, if you don't get enough oxygen, you can suffer from a condition called hypoxia, which can affect your brain and nervous system function. It's also extremely cold and dry at these high elevations, which can lead to hypothermia, dehydration, and altitude sickness. But for the people who live in La Rinconada and other towns in the Andes Mountains and in the highlands of Ethiopia and in the Himalayan mountains in Asia, they have comparably few problems living there. This is because over hundreds of generations, people living in all of these high altitude locations have adapted to the stressful environment. People who live high in the mountains have small changes in their DNA that have allowed their bodies to have slightly larger lungs and for their blood to be able to carry more oxygen and to make up for the small amounts of oxygen that they get in each breath they breathe. These and other kinds of adaptations I'm going to be talking about today all require many generations to become common. Essentially, the people who live in high altitudes have great, who knows how many great grandparents who lived in these regions, and those grandparents had children who then had children and had children all the way down to today. The changes in the DNA that occurred over hundreds of generations have become more and more common because it was a good change to have, because it made life easier in this extreme environment. But it's important to remember it's not just genetic adaptation that has allowed people to thrive high in the mountains. Other biological processes impact humans' ability to thrive and survive in these extreme environments. And one of these is acclimation or acclimatization. Like I said earlier, if I were to move to an extremely high elevation city or town, I would not feel great because I haven't spent a lot of time up there. But after several days or even several weeks or months, my body would acclimate or acclimatize to the region, to this different environment. My body would get used to the low oxygen levels, and eventually I would be pretty much okay. But this is different from adaptation because as soon as I were to move to a lower elevation, maybe move back to my desert home, these changes in my body would reverse. They would go away because they wouldn't be necessary anymore. So humans also are incredibly innovative. We have cultures and technologies that help us survive and thrive in extreme environments around the world. Basic necessities like warm clothes, houses, fire, etc., as well as other more recent advanced technologies are also key to humankind's superhuman ability to thrive around the world. Now, these necessities that I mentioned, the fire, warm clothes, insulated houses, are also key innovations in helping the next group of people that we're going to travel to meet. These people have lived in the frozen environments all across the Arctic in Siberia, Alaska, Greenland, Canada, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. People have lived in these cold regions for tens of thousands of years. So looking at these, does it look like fruits and vegetables would be grown easily in locations like this? No, it's much too cold. The sun barely rises for half of the year. So because of this, before modern technologies such as greenhouses and airplanes to ship fresh fruits and vegetables into the Arctic, people living here ate mostly meat and fish that they hunted from and fished. So because of this high fat diet, these people's bodies have adapted to be able to digest high fat foods much more easily. They've also adapted to the cold environment and cold temperatures by having a faster metabolism, which means their body uses up energy from their food faster, and it helps keep their body temperatures regulated in this cold environment. I'm sure also acclimation plays a part in thriving in the Arctic, at least from my own experience. Like I said earlier, I grew up in a scalding hot town in Arizona, but now I live in New England. In fact, it's snowing right now. I used to think that 60 degrees Fahrenheit was absolutely freezing and required parka to go out in. But I've been living in a northern climate for about 2.5 years now. And in that time, my body has acclimated to the colder temperatures, and I'm comfortable to go outside in 40-degree weather with just a light jacket on. So human biology is pretty amazing, lets us live and thrive in some all over the world, pretty much. So for our next stop on our world tour of superhuman powers, we're going to go back to the high mountains of the Andes in South America. Oops. Here in southwestern Argentina, people have adapted, or northwestern, my mistake, northwestern Argentina, people have adapted to toxic environments. In this region, in the Andes, the groundwater contains higher than average levels of the chemical arsenic. Arsenic is a chemical that, when ingested in too high of quantities, can cause severe illness and cancers in humans. But in spite of this, Indigenous people living in this region have had ancestors living in this region for the past 5,000 years, and adaptations have developed within them that permits their bodies to metabolize the chemical arsenic, basically break it down into a form that is less toxic. I forgot to click again to show my fun toxic water. So people who have lived in this region, they have ancestors who have lived in this region for at least 200 generations, and are able to get by just fine drinking the water that would otherwise cause people not from this region to become very ill. Now, the last adaptation I want to talk about is adaptations that all humans share worldwide, and that is skin color. Skin color is an adaptation to essentially the world, to the environment in which you live in which your ancestors lived in. And specifically, the amount of ultraviolet radiation that part of the world receives. So looking at these two maps, do you notice anything in common between them? The top map shows skin color distributions across the world, while the bottom map shows UV radiation distribution across the world, where our warmer colors, the pinks and the purples, indicate higher levels of ultraviolet radiation. And as you move away from the equator, north and south, it indicates lower levels of ultraviolet radiation. So as you can see, darker skin tones are most common in areas with high ultraviolet radiation. Dark skin has a higher concentration of a chemical called melanin, and this chemical protects skin cells from being damaged by UV radiation. UV radiation can cause skin cells to become cancerous, and also it leads to the breakdown of a chemical called folate, which, if your body loses too much folate, you can become anemic. And as we look at higher latitudes where there's less UV radiation, skin color becomes lighter, and this is for two reasons primarily. One, lots of melanin isn't necessary to protect the skin from to protect skin cells, because there just is less UV radiation hitting the globe at that latitude. And two, having too much melanin in the skin at higher latitudes is actually detrimental, because the body needs some amount of UV radiation to produce vitamin D. Some vitamin D is obtained through the diet, but most of it is synthesized in our skin with the help of UV radiation from the sun. Thus, lighter skin permits the body to continue to create vitamin D even with much lower levels of ultraviolet radiation. So skin color is an adaptation that protects the body from getting too much radiation when you're near the equator, while allowing for vitamin D synthesis near the poles. But of course, regardless of your skin color and where on the globe you're living, it's always important to wear sunscreen if you're gonna be outside in the sun for an extended period of time. But I'm sure you all knew that already. Moving on, there are also so many superpowers that humans have been able to get that has nothing to do with DNA or adaptation. These are all superpowers that you can acquire yourself. These people have worked hard and pushed their body's limits to do some super amazing things. There are people who can hold their breath for a really, really long time. The world record is over 20 minutes. I can only hold my breath for like maybe 30 seconds, so I can't imagine 20 minutes. There's also superhuman strength and super reading abilities. So the woman in the middle bottom of your screen, her name is Anne Jones, and she can read Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows in just 47 minutes. And Kim Peek here on the bottom right-hand side can also read incredibly fast, each of his eyes reading a different page at the same time. So clearly it's not just genetic changes that allow humans to thrive all around the world and do some superhuman things. Cultural innovations, acclimation, just pushing your body's limits, and other biological and cultural processes all play key roles. And in my PhD research, I'm specifically trying to combine data from genetics and culture to conduct a more holistic and nuanced study of human adaptation to extreme environments. So this figure that I'm showing now is just some of the examples of genetic adaptations that have been identified in humans across the globe. And if you recall, we talked about adaptation to cold and high-fat diets in the northern Arctic environments. For my dissertation, I am studying people on the other side of the globe in the sub-Antarctic environments of southern South America. This region includes Patagonia and the island of Tierra del Fuego. And it has similar, though not exactly, or not quite as extreme an environment as the Arctic. In Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, temperatures are cold year round, ranging from about 25 degrees to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the time of year. And because of these low temperatures and poor soil quality, food resources are largely limited to fishing, hunting, and very few native fruits and vegetables. So there has not yet been a study published on genetic adaptations to the environment in Indigenous peoples living in southern South America. And so that is what my dissertation research is looking at. I'm using DNA from ancient and present day individuals who've lived in this region for the individuals I'm working with for the past 6,000 years. However, people have occupied this part of the globe for well over 12,000 years. So I'm interested in looking for genes that might have experienced natural selection as a result of living in this extremely cold environment. And I hypothesize that since this environment is similar to that of the Arctic, Indigenous people from Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego may possess similar genetic adaptations as those that have already been identified in Arctic populations. I'm also studying the archaeology and cultural history of these people to identify cultural innovations that might have helped or might have impacted how people survived and thrived in this region. These are a bunch of images from a European ethnographic voyage in the early 1880s, showing just some examples of the cultural technologies that Indigenous people from Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego used. So when Europeans first began colonizing the region in the 16th and all the way up to the 19th centuries, Indigenous people wore comparatively little clothing in spite of the harsh cold weather. Instead, they wore fur capes covering their shoulders and bodies, and also covered their skin with whale or seal fat, which worked as an excellent insulator against the cold and the wind. And they usually remained next to or nearby fires, whether it be in their homes, as shown in the upper left-hand picture, or on their canoes when they were out fishing and hunting or otherwise traveling. So these and other cultural innovations may have made life more comfortable for the people, and that, along with possible genetic adaptations that I hope to identify, permitted them to survive and thrive in Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. So that is all that I have for today. I want to thank the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History for hosting me, and Brianna and everyone behind the scenes for making this program, all these programs, such a success. These are some links to similar topics if you'd like to learn more about human adaptation or human evolution in general. These are some great resources, and I look forward to answering any and all of your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. And we'll be putting these links in the Q&A. So thanks for that really interesting presentation. And we have lots of questions, so I'm going to dive right in. So the first question is really, 3 people asked similar questions, so I will read them off, but I think they're all kind of asking the same thing. So Jacqueline says, I know it'd be physically stressful if a low altitude person tried to move to a high altitude location, but would someone with these high altitude adaptations struggle to move to a low altitude place? Kennedy asked something similar, would we grow or be better if we had that adaptation since we have more air here? And Jenny asked, is it true that people who are genetically adapted to living in high altitudes don't suffer from symptoms when coming to lower altitudes? Like they don't have to acclimate to living in the lower altitude?
Those are great questions. For the first and third one, for whether people who were born at high altitudes and have hundreds of generations of ancestors at high altitudes and are adapted to high altitude coming to low altitude. There have been studies of that. Off the top of my head, I don't believe they really have any issues, because the main issue with with high altitude is the lack of air, and yeah, it's pretty much just the lack of air. So when you go down to lower altitudes, you have enough air to breathe. So you should be golden at low altitudes. However, that's not my field of expertise. So I might be missing some small biological, what is the word I'm looking for? Small, like relatively small problems that might arise, but I'm not aware of any off the top of my head. The second question, can you repeat the second question?
It was basically a question in the similar vein about, you know, sort of going from being adapted to high altitude to going to low altitude.
Oh yeah, I think it's something to do with being healthier or growing taller. Not necessarily. Everyone is at height is a big thing. Has to do a lot with more the socio-political environment that you grow up in and the nutrients you get while growing, rather than the physical natural environment you live in.
Great, thanks. So this is a great question from Miller. Do the populations in the different high altitudes over the world have the same adaptations, or are there differences among those populations?
So that's actually really cool. It is an example of what we call parallel evolution, where different populations in different regions show similar genetic adaptations. Can actually go back to that really awesome map to show, oh, I hope this map shows it. It's not going to show it. There's, okay, kind of. There's a genetic adaptation called EGLN1, which we see both in populations living in the Himalayas and that living in the Andes Mountains. And so in some cases, we do see similar genetic adaptations between these three populations. And in most other cases, they're different. And the physiological manifestations of these are slightly different. For instance, even though people living in the Andes are more do have genetic adaptations to high altitudes, they suffer from some mountain sickness slightly more frequently than other high altitude locations.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, next question. And actually we can, I will unshare your screen unless we need to go back to, or maybe you can unshare your screen.
I got it.
Great.
There we go.
Unless we need to go back to the slides at some point. So another question on adapting to high altitude. How long does it take, or actually acclimating to high altitude, how long does it take to acclimate to a new higher elevation? For example, if you're going from a coastal city like Miami to a ski resort like Breckenridge, and that was a question from Phil.
It depends largely on your own personal biology, but it can be anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. Usually you'll feel, I used to travel up to the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado every summer when I was a kid, and going from the desert in Arizona to Rocky Mountain National Park, there would be like 1 or 2 days where I'd just be like, oh my goodness, walking 20 feet is exhausting because I wasn't used to the low amount of oxygen. But a day or two, you're pretty much fine.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a question that's kind of along those veins, but it's a more personal question, I guess, from Rosemary. She asks, you mentioned your personal acclimation to cold winter temperature. Do you think this goes hand in hand with losing your acclimation to tolerating hot, dry desert heat?
That's a really good question. And so far, I would say for me, I can only speak personally, so don't take this as science. Personally, I still have no trouble with, 115 degrees dry weather is terrible no matter how long you live in a location. But I feel like I can still tolerate it comparatively okay. So I don't feel like I've lost it. I refuse to lose it.
That's good. Here's a question from Ted. Are the life expectancies of people living in these extreme conditions impacted?
By the extreme condition, I assume?
Yeah, I think so.
So life expectancy is a tricky one. From just a strictly biological standpoint, from what I understand, again, I haven't looked into this 100%, so I could be mistaken, but from what I understand, strictly biologically, no, there isn't any impact on life expectancy, but the socio-political sphere that one lives in impacts life expectancy. For instance, a lot of indigenous populations who are adapted to living at high altitudes in the Andes, because they are indigenous and not a part of the European colonizers. A lot of these peoples suffer from poverty and lack of nutritious foods. So you see a correlation between lower life expectancy and, say, being native to high altitude, but it's not necessarily resulting from high altitude.
It's really more of a cultural issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Here's an interesting question from Will and Mary. If a woman from a low altitude population, I put population in there, spends her entire pregnancy at high altitude, is the baby born acclimatized?
That's an amazing question. I have not thought about that. There is a a term that scientists use a lot called plasticity, which is basically meaning the body's biology being flexible, and that is acclimation and acclimatization is types of plasticity, and there is phenotypic plasticity, which happens as an adult. Things can change back and forth as an adult, but there's also developmental plasticity, where there are non-genetic changes while in utero or shortly after birth while you're developing and growing. I can't answer that question 100%. I could imagine that it's possible that there would be some kind of acclimatization happening, but I don't know off the top of my head.
I
Although
think
I'm going to look it up now.
Maybe a future research study if it hasn't been done. That's a great question.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so back to genetic changes. So Balaz asked, how can you calculate how fast environmental changes show up in the genes or genetic heritable changes in humans? How many generations approximately does this need?
It depends, and I think it depends on a lot of different factors, how detrimental the change is, or how extreme the change is. Many changes can take several hundred generations to become, many adaptations can take several hundred generations to become common. Sometimes it can be only just, I would say maybe less than 100, 10 to 30 generations. I'm thinking of an example not in humans, where it was like almost changed within a couple of generations. During the Industrial Revolution, in London, there were moths that like to hang out on the barks of trees. And they were mostly light colored with a few darker colored individuals in this population. And these moths, there was mostly light colored ones because the bark was light. They blended in on the bark. Dark colored ones, moths wouldn't be seen as well on the bark and would get snatched up. But after the Industrial Revolution, and all of the smoke and the soot from everything coated the trees, made the trees darker, the bark of the trees darker, and we saw a shift in the frequency of dark colored moths. So that species of moth ended up having more dark colored individuals than the light colored ones, because now the dark ones could hide more easily on the dirty bark. So in some organisms, it can take just like 1 or 2 generations for there to be an adaptation. But in humans, it tends to be longer because we are so plastic and able to like be okay at high altitudes for a time and not just die.
Yeah, thankfully.
Yes.
So here's a little bit of a question about acclimatizing. So, you've talked a lot about high adaptations and how people can acclimatize to that and also adaptations to those. But Kathy asks, I presume that one would find it difficult to acclimate to drinking the water with high levels of arsenic. So what's going on with that?
Yes, it would. I don't think acclimation can really work on this, although when I was rehearsing this, a friend mentioned that it could kind of be like the scene from Princess Bride, where the poison is in both containers and he has built up a tolerance so that he can drink the poison. I suppose, depending on the chemical, I don't know if arsenic is one of those chemicals, but I suppose depending on the chemical, you can slowly build up a tolerance to it. However, I would not recommend trying, not worth it.
Agreed.
So in general, no, don't try to acclimate to arsenic in the water if you can help it.
Yep. Okay, great. Next question is from Nona. So she asks, what adaptations in your view are we urban dwellers going through now, considering our current diet and lifestyle?
That is a good question. And I haven't thought too seriously about it, although I definitely should. I would imagine along the lines of high fat, since the Western diet is very high in fats and carbs. There could be, if we stuck with this diet for another 10,000 years, we could see a genetic adaptation to digest these fats differently than our ancestors, our recent ancestors do, or we do now.
The one example I can think of, at least, is I know there have been studies done with people that have different amounts of starch in their diets. And
yes.
there seems to be there's a higher number of copies of a gene that codes for salivary amylase, which helps to digest starchy food. So in modern humans, people living today that have a high starch diet, generally people who eat those types of diets tend to have a higher copy number of this gene that produces more starch to help them actually break down starch. I don't know the time span over which that adaptation has occurred, but there is a difference among modern humans where, it seems to have been driven by diet.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example.
Let's see. Looking through some more questions. So there are a few questions that are on this line. Harvey asks, given the rapid increases in global temperatures, could you comment on how successful humans will be adapting to this change? And Deb asks, can Christina talk about these people in the extremes, I guess how these people in the extremes will be affected by climate change?
They will be affected the most out of all of us, especially those people living in the Arctic already due to global warming. Populations, towns that live on the edge of a frozen plot of land are having to pick up their towns and move them farther inland every couple of years because of rising sea levels and ice melt. And also, again, these populations tend not to be wealthy westernized populations. So there is issues getting proper food and nutrients. Overfishing doesn't help any as well. As for genetic adaptations arising as a result of global warming, I believe that was one of the questions.
Yeah, I think so.
I suppose it's possible. Again, it will be so beyond our lifetime that we would see those genetic adaptations that it's hard to make a concrete comment on them. But global warming is really making life difficult for people living in these extreme environments where suddenly when you're used to one way of being where it's cold year round, which brings certain animals into the region for you to hunt on a regular basis. Now it's warmer, the animals aren't going there anymore, there's nothing to hunt. It gets messy and it's not good.
So like change in resource distribution can be a really big issue.
Exactly.
So I think these two questions are kind of similar, so I'll ask them one after the other. Well, this is more of a comment, but Becky says, I think some athletes train at the higher elevations, so when they compete at the lower elevations, they have better oxygen performance. And then there's a question from Liz who says, so you said the high altitude people do not appear to have to adapt to low altitudes, but do they perform more efficiently, or are they faster or stronger or anything in the relatively oxygen-rich lower altitudes?
Great questions. So the first one with training at high altitudes, yes. Lots of athletes train at high altitudes in order to build up lung capacity for breathing. When you first go to high altitudes, your breathing rate increases and you breathe deeper and faster. So your body just kind of gets used to having more oxygen or more air, maybe less oxygen, but more air in general within your lungs, and then going to either then performing at high altitudes for like football teams that go play the Denver Broncos, I think that's correct. I'm not really into football. And or to compete at lower altitudes, there is a slight advantage. For Indigenous people living at high altitudes, performing at lower altitudes, it wouldn't surprise me if it's the same or a similar thing happens, that there is a slight advantage, but I don't think it would be like appreciable enough to be considered problematic in like a sporting sense. Yeah.
Change the playing field, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, here are two similar questions also that are really purely about speculation. So Cord asks, if we're able to live on a new planet someday, will we have to adapt in any sort of way different than we do in different places on Earth? And Joseph asked, how could we adapt living in space on another planet if we might need to leave Earth for some reason in the future? Thanks.
Good questions. I don't remember which link, but there's a TED Ed. One of the links for TED Ed is specifically talking about adapting to living in space and all of the changes that happens to our body when we're in space and in lower gravity regions. So as for adapting to living on a different planet, it depends on what planet that is. If we say Mars, for example, when you first move to Mars, we would first move to Mars, or even just traveling there, and there would be acclimation or acclimatization happening within the first few generations to the low gravity and probably to either low air supply or just different concentrations of oxygen in the artificial air supply. And we know this because of experiments that we've done with people living in the International Space Station. There was the twin experiment that happened a couple of years ago where we had two twin astronauts. One went up and spent a year in the International Space Station. The other one stayed on Earth. And there was numerous biological differences that occurred for the individual who stayed up in space. Bone density gets very weak because it doesn't seem like it takes a lot of energy to stand up here on Earth where there's gravity, but compared to a microgravity environment, it definitely is harder. And even though it is easier in microgravity, astronauts exercise a lot, they still lose a bunch of bone mass. I used to work at a space museum, so I could go on for probably the remaining time talking about space things, but go into the TED Ed thing for more specific details. So there would be acclimation over time, over a few generations, and maybe we would see genetic adaptations arise from a random mutation or from some standing genetic pattern that doesn't really help us now, but would help us on a different planet. And that would get passed on to offspring, who would then pass it on to their offspring. And over time, it would probably become more common. So it's feasible, but again, it takes 5,000 years at least.
Okay, a few questions about skin color adaptations. So this one is from Cord. Can my skin color change if I am put through more or less UV? And then a question from Gary. If skin color is an adaptation, that implies it's a change from a basic unadapted color. What is the Homo sapiens unadapted skin color?
Great questions. The first one, oh shoot, what was the first one? My brain.
That's okay. The first one was about, can your skin color change if you're basically exposed to more or less UV?
That depends on if you can tan. Tanning is another form of the plasticity that I was talking about earlier. And there's an underlying genetic ability to tan. For instance, I cannot tan. I am white until I am red, and that's it. So that would be the only skin color change that would happen, is spend more time in the sun, your skin could tan and darken that way.
And that's an example of acclimation, right?
Yeah,
As opposed
exactly.
to adaptation. Yeah.
Exactly. Because it's happening within one person in one lifetime, as opposed to across many people over numerous generations.
Yeah.
As for a baseline skin tone, humans evolved in Africa at very near the equator, and so thus the dark skin tone is what you would call a baseline. But it's also an adaptation because it's helpful. So
yeah, it's a good
adaptations aren't necessarily changes. They could just be what it is there. But for the most part, like what I was discussing, they were changes.
Yeah, and my understanding about skin color too is that having light skin is adaptive if you're living further from the equator, but having darker skin is adaptive if you're living closer to the equator. So exactly. I saw two questions that are kind of about ancient humans. So Harold asks, does this apply to extinct species like Cro-Magnon man or Cro-Magnon, who are modern or Homo sapiens as well? They existed 100,000 years unchanged and were well adapted to the Ice Age cold compared to Homo sapiens. Where are their adaptations today? And I did see another question about, Kathy asks, can we learn from fossils how ancient peoples may have adapted and apply that to humans today?
Yes, that is what I'm hoping to do. Actually, the second question with the looking at ancient humans and adaptation. So I'm hoping with the individuals who have lived anywhere from 300 to 6,000 years ago, that I have DNA that their DNA that I'm working with. I will look for signals of the genetic adaptations that I think might be present, and see how that might change over time. If from a logic point of view, one would think I hypothesize that the individuals who are the oldest, my 6,000-year-old individual or 3,500-year-old individual, might possess these genetic adaptations to the cold climate, but they also might not, because at that point people had been living in that region for around 6,000 years, which may have been enough time for genetic adaptations to arise, but may not have. But if this genetic adaptation is beneficial, then the less ancient individuals from several hundred years ago would hypothetically, or I hypothesize, would all possess these genetic adaptations, as well as individuals living today. So yeah, we can use ancient DNA to kind of get a window back into time to look at how adaptations have evolved over time. And as for our ancestral hominins like Cro-Magnon or Neanderthals, as long as, for skin color specifically, as long as we can get DNA from those individuals, which the oldest human DNA we have acquired is about 400,000 years old from a Neanderthal. Then we can look and see if they possess changes within their DNA sequence that today imply certain skin tones. I know there was a recent paper out that talked about sequenced the DNA of a Neanderthal individual and was able to say that this person had blue eyes and red hair, and I don't remember skin tone. But it's also important to realize that, yes, these genetic adaptations do oftentimes imply certain external characteristics, like blue eyes or brown hair, but the genome is so complicated, and there's so many other factors, as I was talking about with acclimation and other things, that we can't necessarily say for sure this is what that individual looked like. but it's our best guess given the DNA data and knowledge and understanding that we have. So anything older than that, we can't really say skin tone or skin color, unless by some miracle there is preserved in frost a mummy of a human mummy that's even older than that, but I don't think that has been found yet. If it exists.
I don't think so. Could be though,
So,
maybe in the future. So we have about 5 more minutes. I'll squeeze in a few more questions. Here, a question from Lily who asks, if you were from Miami and you moved to Antarctica, would your body be able to adapt to the same level as someone who's from Antarctica? And actually, Rowan and Saoirse asked, does anyone live in the middle of Antarctica?
So scientists who are crazy
the scientists, yeah, who are crazy.
But
right.
It's like 50-mile-per-hour winds and sub-zero temperatures all the time. So no humans have lived in Antarctica prior to, oh man, I don't even know the year off the top of my head, but like the late 1800s, I think people started exploring Antarctica, but prior to that, no one lived there. So no one has evolved to live in the Antarctic environment. And even those populations in the Arctic that I was talking about, they're not living necessarily on the poles. They're slightly further south. So I don't think it's possible for humans to adapt genetically over generations to that extreme, such as that's found in Antarctica. I cannot comment on whether you can acclimate. Maybe scientists who spend a lot of time at the research stations in Antarctica have gotten used to the absolutely insanely extreme environment, but I think it would be really hard.
And it seems like it would still be more of cultural wearing clothing sorts of things than probably like genetic adaptations, I suspect.
Definitely.
So here are 2 similar questions, I think. So the first question is from Cecilia. Oops, where did it go? I may have accidentally oh no, there it is. Can humans develop genetic changes to adapt to a particular environment after birth? And then a similar question, I think, is, oh, there's so many questions and I lost the one that I was looking for. Is from Connie, do we know if epigenetic changes feed into acclimatization?
Great questions. So for the first one, whether genetic changes can occur after birth, genetic adaptation cannot occur after birth. And the definition of adaptation means that it takes many, many, many generations. So perhaps some random change does occur in an individual, but it's not necessarily going to make any difference like widespread. You couldn't tell, essentially. Like there might be a change, there might be beneficial biological result of that genetic change, but it really isn't until that spreads throughout a population that we can call it a genetic adaptation. In most cases, if there is genetic adaptations are actually very rare, because in most cases, if there is a change in DNA sequence after birth, it either gets fixed by our cellular machinery and goes away, or it is very bad and can cause cancers or cause other maladies. So in short, no, any changes that happen after birth can be attributed more to acclimation or acclimatization. And as for epigenetics, I am no expert in epigenetics, but it is possible. Epigenetics, for those who aren't familiar with it, is changes to the DNA that is not the DNA structure or the DNA sequence. So it could be a chemical added onto the top of one of this part of the DNA that makes that part of the DNA not be able to be sequenced. So I can imagine that those changes might have something to do, I would assume they would have something to do with acclimation and climatization, but I'm not an expert, so
That's
I'm not really sure.
All right, I'm going to try to do two quick last questions. The first one is from Kathy, and she asks, what possible adaptation could lactose intolerance be? It's not really helpful to me.
That's great. I actually, in another incarnation of this talk, when I'm giving it to children, I talk about lactose intolerance. So lactose intolerance is actually the baseline for human populations. Within most populations around the world, once a child is weaned from their mother's milk, they cannot digest the sugar lactose anymore. The chemical in their digestive system, or the enzyme in their digestive system known as lactase, which breaks down the sugar, just goes away naturally. But in populations in Africa, the Middle East, and in Europe, where animals were domesticated, some specifically domesticated for their milk production, genetic adaptations have arisen. And these are all, interestingly, the same genetic adaptation or the same gene is affected, allowing the persistence of this lactase enzyme into adulthood. And this is an adaptation because in regions where maybe food can be scarce, but you have your cows or your goats or your camels with you, you can subsist on the milk they produce. So you're able to survive and still get nutrients without killing your animals when there isn't enough food around. So for the most part, lactose intolerance is like the norm, but in places or in populations who have ancestors that domesticated milk producing animals, they are able to digest milk.
So it's lactase persistence that's the adaptation, really, and the intolerance is our ancestral condition, like other mammals.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, last question. I know we're almost done, but I think this is a great opportunity to think about how evolution works. So Cord, who, by the way, has asked a ton of questions. Thank you, Cord, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, including there's dozens of questions that are unanswered still. But last question is from Cord. If one of your parents tanned themselves, will you have a darker skin tone?
That's a great question. In this case, no, because the instance of tanning, the process of tanning, is like an acclimation that we talked about. It happens to a single individual and it doesn't change the individual's genetic structure or genetic sequence. And it's necessary to have the genetic sequence. If we were to pass it on, it has to be within the genetic sequence, because that's where what you get from your parents. You get half of your DNA from your mom and half of your DNA from your dad. And tanning does not change the genetic sequence within the cells that lead to an offspring being created. So
great, thank you. Yeah, that difference between acclimation and adaptation. So awesome. So we're going to wrap up, but a few people have asked if there's an email address or another way that they might be able to contact you if they have further questions. So maybe we'll wrap up with that, and I'll say thank you to everybody. So if you have.
Yeah, I do. Should I type it in the Q&A, or it's?
I think you can just read it out, or if you have something like that, or if there's a way for them to Google you.
Yes. Yeah, Googling might be hard. I don't have a website yet. But my email is C as in Charlie, M as in Mary, and then my last name, Balentine, B as in boy, ALENTINE @utexas.edu. So cmbalentine@utexas.edu.
Excellent. Thank you,
Yeah.
Christina. This was a fantastic presentation. And for those of you who would like to watch it again, it will be up on the NMNH Video Webinar Archives webpage in a couple of weeks. So we are planning on having these hot topic discussions every month, usually on the third Thursday of the month from 11:30 to 12:30 Eastern Time. Everybody who registered today will be emailed with information about future hot topic events. And thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Brianna Pobener. I'm a research scientist and educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Thanks for all of your questions and thanks for tuning in today. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.